Welcome and thank you for visiting our presentation. I'm Lorian Jordan and together with Ying Sui, we are presenting our project Critical Theory Finds Its Method. This is a brief introduction to critical ethnography and its analytical processes. To begin, I'll give a quick snapshot of critical ethnography, including its origins, purposes, and key players. Then Ying will take over and present on the analytic process of critical ethnography. So let's get started. Let's begin with a quick reminder of the origins of critical ethnography, which is, of course, ethnography, the descriptive study of a culture. Ethnography stems from the Greek word ethnos, meaning people, and graphy, to write or record. Ethnography has early origins in ancient Greece, when Herodotus went from culture to culture, recording the social practices of people in the 3rd century. Since then, anthropologists and other scholars have used ethnography as a way to study, through observation, the social phenomena and lived experiences of others, Europeans typically going into Asian, African, and South American cultures. Ethnography largely derived from the theoretical perspectives shaped by colonialism, and as such, ethnographers risk adopting these colonizing discourses, constructing the other as primitive. During the 1960s, a growing distaste for positivist and objectivist ideas of value-free ethnography were growing. Some researchers were dissatisfied with anthropology's and sociology's then current practices of representing others without the consideration of multiple views, without the researcher's intentional focus of the political, social, economic, or cultural context of the phenomena, and the researcher's neglect of his or own power and positionality. These researchers begin to note that ethnographers seem to define ethnography actually with the Greek stem ethnikos, which means heathens, to describe their marginalizing practices of describing the other. During this time, researchers and academics in general were becoming more politically active. This led some ethnographers to advocate for researchers to engage in cultural critiques of society and its institutions, and work the divides between powerful and powerless. They began to conduct research in unconventional environments, such as workplaces rather than tribal systems, and/or with marginalized groups. So, what then does critical ethnography mean, and what does it seek to do? Schwant defines critical ethnography as ethnographic studies that engage in cultural critique by examining larger political, social, and economic issues that focus on oppression, conflict, struggle, power, and praxis. It is a research practice that shifts ethnography's interest in what is to understanding why something is and what can be done to change it for the better. Guided by the philosophies of critical theory, a researcher aims to link social phenomena to wider socio-historical events and expose prevailing systems of domination, discourse, and ideology, so social situations can be redefined. Some critical ethnographers take this further and suggest that just calling attention to injustice and power is not enough. We must also change these systems of power for the social good. Karspekin defines the researcher who engages in critical ethnography as a criticalist who is involved in social activism. Madison goes further to describe critical ethnography as the performance of critical theory. It is the space where critical theory finds its method. As theory is so important to critical ethnography, I thought it would be useful to go through some of the basic theoretical assumptions. The first, and a pretty important one, is that a critical ethnographer values multiple epistemologies and believes that there's no objective way to describe knowing or to know. The critical ethnographer thus resists domestication, which basically implies that the researcher cannot get saturated by one way of knowing, one way of producing knowledge, and one way of researching. Instead, she can use all of the resources and skills and the privileges available to her to make accessible and penetrate the borders of different societies, to break through people's defenses and get to the voices and experiences of the subjects who are out of reach and or silenced. Another assumption is that researchers have an ethical responsibility to address institutions of injustice within particular lived domains. These ideas stem from looking back to the past colonizing practices of ethnography and the current ideas of social justice, moral principles of human rights, and a belief in personal obligations to make a contribution to changing conditions that hinder freedom. Critical ethnographers deny academic ideas of positivism and objectivism and the taken for granted assumptions of neutrality within these orientations. Instead, they advocate that science cannot and should not attempt to be neutral. It should be value-laden to best attend to the needs of the communities, populations, and people under study. Critiques of early critical ethnographers have focused on the way that researchers made stands towards social change while also neglecting the personal focus on their power, privileges, and positionality as the researchers. No person who produces knowledge from everyday people to researchers are politically neutral. In a process called turning back, the researcher is instructed to position themselves within the research and the community to acknowledge personal power, privilege, and bias. They must be intentional in considering how representing people and experience becomes an act of colonization. Similarly, we must be reflexive and attend to the ways in which our interactions with the other mediates the production of our knowledge of the other. Early critical ethnographers were heavily influenced by Marxism and other critical social theories such as critical race theory. However, it has now expanded to many forms of critical theory, such as decolonizing and borderland feminisms. Theory is important to the method and analysis on several levels. The first is to focus where you will begin to look for power discourses. For example, do you focus on gender roles and societal messages through a feminist lens? Theory assists in your articulation and identification of the hidden forces and ambiguities that operate beneath the surface. It helps to guide judgments and evaluations that emanate from the discontent of your population, to direct attention on the critical expressions within different communities relative to their unique symbol systems, customs, and codes. It helps to demystify the ubiquity and magnitude of power. It helps to provide insight and inspire acts of justice, and to name and analyze what you intuitively feel as a researcher. Madison suggests that we must begin a critical ethnography with a consideration of central methodological questions. These can help us to shape the purpose of the work we will do and to keep a critical lens on our own participation in the process. She asks us to ask ourselves, the first, how do we reflect upon and evaluate our own purpose, intentions, and frames of analysis as researchers? How do we predict consequences or evaluate our own potential to do harm? How do we create and maintain a dialogue of collaboration in our research projects between ourselves and others? How is the specificity of the local story relevant to the broader meanings and operations of the human condition? How, in what location, or through what intervention will our work make the greatest contribution to equity, freedom, and justice? This brings us to a consideration of the use and purpose of critical ethnography. Karspekin described it as a process of cultural reconstruction, moving from what is to what could be. Madison suggests that critical ethnography should contribute to emancipatory knowledge and the discourse of social justice by bringing light to underlying and possibly obscure power and control. Foley and Valenzuela suggest that two forms of critical ethnography have emerged. The first is the anthropology of cultural critiques, wherein a researcher's aim is to revise social theory by making the public and participants aware of social inequalities and injustice. Others have argued that while this is the most common form of critical ethnography, it positions the author as expert that speaks for others. A smaller population of researchers become intentional activists, deeply involved in progressive movements and community-based reforms. This is believed to be a smaller population because of institutional restraints that we'll discuss in a couple of slides. Overall, critical ethnography can be seen cited frequently within the educational and pedagogy research, as well as in nursing research. I've also come across a few in different things such as marketing and design. While the field of education has embraced critical ethnography, it has a rich background in sociology and anthropology. The Chicago School of Ethnography was developed in the 1920s in the anthropology department of the University of Chicago. Here, researchers moved from studies of faraway people to the urban landscape of Chicago. In the 1950s, sociologist C. Bright Mills studied class inequalities, class alliances, and he was deeply concerned with the researcher's responsibility for political engagement. In the 1960s, the anthropologist Sol Tax was a classical ethnographer who, following a study of Guatemalan markets, became dissatisfied with his work and began a field school in Iowa to develop a new kind of anthropology. He called this action anthropology, which was aimed at producing research that could solve the problems of a community. In the 1970s, the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies out of the University of Birmingham was an early adopter of an interdisciplinary approach to the study of culture through the intersection of ethnography, sociology, and critical social theory. In the current days, educational researcher Phil Karspeken developed an outline methodology of critical ethnography, providing methodological theory and empirical techniques in his book Critical Ethnography and Educational Research. It should be noted that he considers critical ethnography to be just another name for critical qualitative research. He is currently at the University of Indiana, and the link to his website is on our notes page. Sonini Madison, which I probably pronounced her name wrong, is an activist, researcher, performer, professor. She promotes critical ethnography as an emancipatory and performative practice. Her book, Critical Ethnography, Methods, Ethics, and Performance, gives voice to the ethical need of the researcher to improve people's lives. Performance gives the public a place to discuss, participate, and become responsible for change as well. She's currently a professor of performance studies with appointments in anthropology and African American studies at Northwestern University. Her link is also on the notes page. In Jim Thomas's book, Doing Critical Ethnography, he defines guidelines for praxis-oriented ethnography that is critically, ideologically, and scientifically engaged towards justice. He is a professor emeritus at Northern Illinois University, and his research interests lie in criminal justice systems and prison culture, and his link is also available. As you can imagine, there are some challenges which come with critical ethnography. The first is that it can be draining on one's resources, such as time and money, to be involved in emancipatory and justice-oriented work. There's little funding for research in general, and then less to spend more time in the field making possibly costly changes in a community. Similarly, academic institutions might be more inclined to reward scholarship, which is broadly generalizable rather than locally relevant. Also, within academia, one must publish. To do so requires following certain conventions in language, page limits, and general structure. To publish, you might be required to modify your words and possibly meanings to fit in a politically acceptable way. There are bound to be many stakeholders when conducting critical ethnography, from your institution to your funders to the community to your own needs. All of these have competing and possibly conflicting demands that must be met. Finally, there is always a risk towards colonizing practices when you seek to speak for the needs of another. This must be monitored and attended to with reflexivity and collaboration throughout your study, analysis, and dissemination.